we'll do the live thing first. Like, hey everybody, welcome back to the Bigmark podcast. It's me, your host, Bigmark. If it's your first time watching, welcome. If not, welcome back. Like I always say, if you ever want to reach out to the podcast, let us know if you want to hear about a new topic, or if you ever want to join as a guest, please reach out to us on our DMs on X or Instagram at the Bigmark podcast or at the Bigmark pod. You can check us out there. However you'd like to get a hold of us, leave a comment under the video. If you're watching on YouTube, make sure you subscribe to the channel. That's always the best way to support the channel, is support us here. If you ever wanted to support that way, that's the best way you can, is subscribing and, letting everyone know, letting people, I should say, that you think would like the podcast. I mean, you can let everyone know about the podcast, but people you think will listen anyway, let them know about the podcast and spread the word. You can also check out our Patreon, patreon.com/thebigmarkpod. We got a couple different ways to donate there, so check it out. Again, thank you so much for joining us. I appreciate it. If you've read this book, if you haven't read this book, thank you for joining. I mean, if you haven't read this book, it's a great little synopsis. And if you have read this book, it's going to be a nice little trip down memory lane. But please go and read this book if you haven't. If somehow this video or this episode somehow came across your purview and you haven't read this, and you're interested in music and you're interested in neuroscience and psychology and sociology and human behavior and things like that, this is an excellent book. It's called This Is Your Brain on Music, subtitled The Science of Human Obsession, which I thought was a really interesting subtitle because as we go through this a little bit more, you can kind of potentially link some of these behaviors and some of these things that we think about music potentially about other people's obsessions, right? But again, interesting subtitle. Daniel J. Levitin, neuroscientist, neurophysicist, which I think is such a cool title. Sounds extremely lofty, and not to say it isn't, not to downplay it, but it is. Neuro, psychology, the mind, and physicist, physical, the world. It's how the human brain interacts with the world. So basically, you study how our senses work, more or less. And this is a perfect field to study music, being that it uses mostly all of the senses. I mean, smell, I guess, in the sense if you're listening to music and you're you're opening a vinyl, putting the vinyl in, and you can smell the case itself, and there's a distinct smell that's associated. But that's not necessarily something that is required for listening to and understanding music. Came out in 2006 in Canada and was released in 2007 in the United States. Daniel did his work out of McGill University in Montreal. And his findings, he was using his findings in neuroscience and music, and he was trying to take those findings and make them more accessible kind of to the layman, educated layperson. Levitin also does an excellent job at explaining, basic music concepts, music theory, things like that. That it's funny when in the book, he writes, if you are a musician and you know these concepts, feel free to skip ahead because, I myself as a musician know a lot of those basic concepts. So it was a little bit arduous sometimes reading through some of those bits, but still great to kind of just go over the basics. It's never a bad moment to hone the basics, especially with music. But again, he kind of goes through some of those theory concepts and, how many beats in a bar, how many beers in a bar, whole notes, half notes, quarter notes, eighth notes, all that jazz. Hey. And he does a really good job at actually linking those concepts to and explaining how the brain interprets and processes those characteristics. So again, music is essentially hijacking some of those basic processes that are happening in the brain and playing with them, that we feel this sense of enjoyment. I guess musicians, you should say, not necessarily music itself, but the people who are making the music are kind of hijacking those processes. When we're young, we develop schemas. When we're children, we develop these schemas that influence our musical taste. So again, it depends on how you were brought up, what music you listen to. Again, being in the Western culture, most of us have this kind of base. But if you grew up in different parts of the world, you're going to have a completely different understanding for the kind of basic concepts of music. So what you like and what you're going to seek in music that you like is going to start acting right. You're going to start to develop expectations. The deep emotions that we feel when listening to music is a result of having these expectations violated. So we have these expectations that we think how music's supposed to go, and whether that's tugging on our heartstrings, making us feel a certain way, the way the music is written, it's changing those expectations, and it's doing something that we're not necessarily expecting. So it's always interesting when writing good music and creating new music. It's interesting because sometimes you have to go against maybe the grain a little bit, maybe how music theory should actually be, or is that note actually part of the scale? And it's like, hey, does it sound good? Does it sound interesting? Does it make you feel? Because that's what music's all about. It's art, man. And good music has to strike a balance between complexity or novelty. It has to balance that between simplicity and familiarity. So complexity and simplicity, novelty, familiarity. It's hard to find that balance, not necessarily all the time, but in a unique way that's never been done, especially up until this point. But again, you can't just have a complex song where there's just random sounds happening and it's just going to sound like noise. And then you can't just have a steady beat going on. I mean, apart from certain dance, electronic dance music, some of that is, yes, it's extremely repetitive and not necessarily extremely complex, but it still has a way of conveying emotion and conveying feelings. In some of Levitin's work, he found that odd time signatures actually keep us coming back. So songs that are written that don't have the common time signature, which is 4/4 timing, which is 4 beats per 4 quarter notes equal 1 whole beat per bar. There's 4 beats per bar. Okay, yeah, let's not go deep into the music theory. We won't necessarily go too deep into the neuroscience today. In honor of Daniel Levitin's work, we don't want to go too complicated. We want people to understand what's going on. But when we change things, again, when we change things slightly, it tends to make us actually want to come back and listen to it more and understand it a little bit more. It's not necessarily something that's going to push us away. Structure and form in music is an illusion that's only created in the brain. You know, music does only exist between our ears. In the environment, it's just air being pushed. You know, even the sound that you're hearing right now, either through your speakers or through your headphones, you're hearing my voice, and it's just the sound. The speakers are physically moving air, and your eardrums are picking that vibration up, and then your auditory system is interpreting that, and then your amygdala comes into play. And again, we won't go too heavy duty. But most musicians have a larger amygdala, which is also an emotional center of the brain. But very interesting. But the structure and form is purely conditioning. So whether you went to school or not, you know, you're going to have a completely different understanding of structure and form of music. But that being said, all humans are insanely aware of tiny nuances and details in music. Like, if we played an 8-note melody for someone that's familiar, that they know and they've memorized, even if they're not a musician, they're gonna know when there's a wrong note in that melody. Maybe they're not gonna be able to tell you that it's a fucking A when it should be a B or whatever. but they can tell that something's off. So you can't really fool people as much as you think you can sometimes with music. Essentially, Levitin got into the more socio-dynamic conversation in saying that music is core to what it means to be human. It's present in all human societies. Musical instruments are the oldest human artifacts. So there's something inherent about music. There's something really, really special about music. And this challenges Steven Pinker's auditory cheesecake assertion. Basically, music is just it tickles all the right senses, and it makes us feel good, just like cheesecake does. But Steven Pinker says that music was an incidental byproduct of evolution. But Levitin's work argues instead that music served as an indicator of cognitive, emotional, and physical health. And that makes sense because, again, if you are understanding music and you're remembering songs and you're singing with everyone in a group, and that's showing cognitive ability. If you're able to interact with people in a social way, that's showing some emotional capacity, able to react to how that music is playing and understanding how the difference between a happy song and a sad song. And physical health too, right? You're not gonna be able to sing if you can't fucking breathe. You have some type of respiratory illness, or you can't dance and move around, because again, a lot of times in early human societies, music and dance were so congruent. And that's the other thing, that music was so much a communal thing. It was more, everyone was a musician. And again, this speaks to Levitin's findings, in that every human has this ability to make and understand and listen, and unless you have something wrong with your brain, of course. But you have these abilities to make and understand and live, and music is so important to us as human beings, and we seem to crave it no matter what happens. We hate being, if it's a completely, look at elevators, for instance, most of the time. I mean, not every elevator has music in it now, but for most of human history, elevators that could play music would play music, because there's something about just sitting in a fucking square box doing nothing, that you just play a little music, and it's a lot. It's something. It speaks to us, and in some ways, maybe it was advantageous, as Levitin says, it was advantageous as a force that led to social bonding and increased fitness. Again, because you are making music with people, you can enter that flow state. I've said many times on this podcast that music, playing music on stage, at least the way I have with my bands, you do experience this flow state, and this bonding occurs between you and your bandmates. And I'm sure that would occur on the larger scale. And at some point we said, okay, let's move the best musician forward, and let's all watch the musician. Yes, okay, maybe it was a question of numbers and we only had so many people. But at a certain point we started saying, okay, let's just all sit back and watch the best musician instead of actually all joining in and making music together as a community. It's a really interesting concept, and the book is great. And there's also 2 documentary films that were based on the book. The musical Brain, that came out in 2009, featuring Levitin as a host, along with appearances by Sting, Michael Bublé, Feist, and Wyclef Jean. And then the second documentary was The Music Instinct, which came out the same year. And Levitin and Bobby McFerrin were co-hosts, with appearances by Yo-Yo Ma, Jarvis Cocker, Daniel Barenboim, Oliver Sacks, and others. And in 2009, Harvard University announced that This Is Your Brain on Music would be required reading in its freshman core program in general education, which I think is fantastic. It's an excellent book, and I think Daniel Levitin does an amazing job. I know I've said it already. He does an amazing job at bringing these pretty complex concepts into a more digestible form that's going to allow you to understand this. Again, it's pretty heavy on the neuroscience, but just have a little anatomy textbook with you. Bring it out with you. I mean, I know it doesn't tell you much, but it's something when you can actually point to some of these these neurostructures that he speaks of. And again, when you do that, which I found helpful in studying psychology, when some of these structures are mentioned, try to find a little bit more information on the structures themselves, understand what other processes are involved with those structures are usually doing, which again, based on general neurobiology, it's just more concentrated neurons in certain areas that tend to do certain tasks in the brain, release certain neurotransmitters, but it's also very diffuse. The brain is very diffuse. There's neurotransmitters all over the brain. But again, we more or less know through various forms of testing where a lot of these things work in the brain. And it's really fascinating to see how much that really does all come together. Just to be able to listen to music and see all those structures light up, auditory cortexes, again, amygdala, hypothalamus, neurocingulate cortexes, all these crazy things. And then to play music too, because now you're introducing a lot more physicality to it, and you're using your motor cortex and all these things. Again, now, listen to me, I'm mentioning all these neurostructures, these brain compartments, when I said I wouldn't. My bad. But again, I think one of the biggest takeaways is the goal of art is to convey universal truth. And true success is creating lasting, meaningful works of art. And if we understand these concepts, if we understand these deeper meanings of how the brain works and how other people understand how music works, we can use these concepts to create amazing music and to break these expectations and to continue this lifelong, this generational, this human activity that is making music. Again, thank you all for listening. I love y'all. I always love you for listening. Go check out our other episodes. 200 other episodes to go check out. So thanks for coming this long. Check it out. This is Your Brain on Music by Daniel J. Levitin. Check it out on audiobook on Spotify. Check it out in print. It's available in paperback. Penguin Books. I don't know. I'm not sponsored. Check them out. Love y'all. This is Your Brain on Music, not a fried egg. Love y'all. YouTube's Patreon. Peace.